had the chance to meet Melissa in the past and discuss spiritualism and the supernatural in New Orleans, and I actually had the privilege of joining her at a seance in New Orleans earlier this year. Maybe we can touch on that before the end of the conversation. So let me introduce our author. Melissa Daggett teaches United States history at San Jacinto College. Her debut book, Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans, The Life and Times of Lewis Henry Ray, chronicles the history of modern American spiritualism in the Crescent City, with an emphasis on a francophone seance circle that was led by Henry Louis Ray, a Creole of color who was a key civil rights activist, author, and Civil War and Reconstruction leader. Melissa divides her time between Houston and New Orleans, and I'm going to hand the conversation directly to her to tell us about this subject that piques so many of our interests.
Good morning, and thank you for braving the cold weather to attend the Louisiana Book Festival. My name is Melissa Daggett, and I'm going to be presenting some information to you about my book. I do have a PowerPoint prepared, but there are some techie problems, so maybe we can get back to that. It's on the computer there, but we're having trouble connecting it to the screens. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the background of the book and how I came to write the book. It began as a graduate student at the University of New Orleans. I was taking history. I was going into a master's program, and we have to do something original research. So I thought, no problem, I'll do X or I'll do Y. Well, the problem was X and Y had already been done, and I needed to come up with Z. So I went over to the UNO Special Collections Department, and I talked to the archivist. And the archivist led me to some records. And he said, these are really wonderful. People take them out all the time, but there's a problem. And by the way, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I can turn. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, they're in French, and people will take them out, and they realize that they're not easy to translate, and then they just give up. And I said, great, I'm fluent in French. So I decided to work on these papers. This is all part of the René Grandjean collection, housed today at the University of New Orleans. And they were seance records. So I didn't know too much about them. Nothing much had been written about them. And I decided that maybe what it was, the records would chronicle the free people of color who transitioned into being the former free people of color with the Civil War. So I came up with that beginning thesis, and sure enough, it did play out. So I read through really all of the seance books, and I began writing a paper, and people would tell me, well, you know what? I think that would be a good book. But I'd already thought of that earlier, and I'd already planned to expand my papers into a book. So that's what I did once I graduated from the University of New Orleans with a master's degree in history. And then, of course, as authors know, it can be quite a grueling task to get the book to actual publication. But thank you, University Press of Mississippi, for helping me out. And this is the finished product, of course. So that's the background. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about spiritualism. So as I wrote my book, I realized the book had to be a little bit larger than just focusing on seance records. And by the way, the leader of this group was a man named Henry Louis Ray, hence the subtitle, The Life and Times of Henry Louis Ray. So I was doing research into his background, but also research into spiritualism that started, the spiritualism that I'm talking about would be more phenomenal with the seance and the Ouija boards and things like that. That began in 1848 in a small town in New York, in western New York. The town's name, Hyattsville, New York. And the two girls, these were the Fox sisters, some of you may be familiar with them already, but apparently they were playing games with Mom. This is 1848, and they kept hearing these noises in the house, and finally the girl said, well, you know, this is a spirit, and we can communicate with the spirit. So they developed a way to communicate. It was 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. And then they expanded that level of communication by going through the alphabet. So when a certain letter would come up, you would hear a knock. So Mom, relatives, friends were all frantic about this. Of course, they weren't. And the news spread, and an older sister decided that she would make some money out of this. Now, how would you make money? Well, here's how. The girls would do private seances in which the people would have to pay, and they would also do public lectures. So at the public lectures, there were a lot of naysayers who did not believe that these girls could communicate with the dead, but they could never figure out where the knocks were coming from, and finally they discovered what it was. And it turned out, and I still don't understand this, but it turned out the girls could crack their toes, and it would make enough noise to sound like a knock. Well, I don't get it either. But they were exposed as frauds and charlatans, and you would have thought that that would be it, that they were done. But no, people were enthralled by the idea of communicating with the dead. Spiritualism had been around for, centuries. But this was more of a direct communication. So the advent of spiritualism began in western New York, went throughout the state, went over to the Midwest, and slowly went south. The reason why, one of the reasons why it was not going to the south as quickly as you would expect was because the South was very conservative. And spiritualism was an ism, an ISM, an ism, radicalism, abolitionism, feminism. So it's associated with radical causes. So the people in the ministers, the leadership in the South did not like that. However, there was one area in the South that spiritualism did become important. And can you guess what city? That's right, New Orleans. So New Orleans was the center, the epicenter of spiritualism in the South, and it found adherents among both the white citizens, African American citizens, but mostly white. It also, during this time, you had a lot of French-speaking people. So it did start to become popular. Now, it became even more popular because people from the north came down Mississippi River and spent time in New Orleans shoring up the spiritualists. And this, I believe, made an impression on Henry Louis Ray, who was a young man. Now, a little bit about his background. He was part of a very select, very elite group of people, the free people of color. And he came from a family that had come originally from Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, and they moved over to Cuba because of the Haitian Revolution, and from Cuba they were expelled because of the Napoleonic Wars. So New Orleans proved to be a good area for these people, as well as many white citizens, to live. So, and also, New Orleans, of course, was French-speaking. So he came from a rather elite group of people. These people were very well-read, very well-schooled. Among them were leaders in medicine, literature, real estate in particular. So we see now the Faubourg Marigny, the Faubourg Tremé, they had many of these people living in there. So the people came down, different people, spiritualists, came down the river, and this became more popular. One of the important newspapers at that time for spiritualism, unfortunately I can't show it because we don't have a connection, was the Banner of Light, and that was based in Boston. So when I was doing my research, I thought, I need to get copies of the Banner of Light. And so I looked online, I couldn't find it. I realized I could get copies like at Harvard or Boston. And then finally I've discovered there was a full run at the SMU, Southern Methodist University, of all places in Texas, in Dallas. There's a full run. And these were the actual copies, not the microfiche or anything like that, the actual copies. Very large copies, very large print. They were just in excellent condition, almost a full run. Now, when I told people I was looking at the Boston newspaper to find out about New Orleans, they said, well, that didn't make any sense. But I thought there would be a connection, and sure enough there was, because a number of people that came from this spiritualist newspaper wrote about it. So I found out a lot of information about New Orleans via a Boston newspaper, via a periodical. So Henry Louis Ray was involved in spiritualism in the late 1850s. He also was involved with the Native Guard, and in case you don't know, the Native Guard was a Confederate regiment. It was actually free people of color. They didn't actually participate in the Civil War, but they were out there. They pledged allegiance to the South. Once General Butler came to town, then they changed their allegiance and they became Union officers. So after the Civil War, Henry Louis Ray returned to spiritualism, and he was involved with a guy named Valmore. Valmore, I believe, was also involved with voodoo. So I saw a number of characters that originally were involved with Marie Laveau, and then later on voodoo. Spiritualism. So Valmore was one of these people, and he was considered to be a healing medium. He was, again, a free person of color, and he would place his hand or give some type of potion to the people to heal them. So he was extremely popular. His popularity faded a little bit. He got criticized heavily by the Catholic Church at that time. And then later on, still later, no longer was he the main medium. He was the participant with Henry Louis Ray. His circle was called the Cercle Harmonique, the harmonic circle. And sort of a play on words. So circle is also the seance group, but also it's like some type of cohesive group. So it's called the Cercle Harmonique. Harmony in the sense of everybody's getting along, and because of these vibrations, the spirits would be more likely to come. So he took over where Valmore left off, and he began writing these registers. If you look at and unfortunately I can't show it to you because we got tech problems, but if you look at the registers, you can go to the index. The index is actually at the beginning of the book rather than the end, and you can see the different messengers. Many of them were writers from France. Many of them were actually political figures like Washington or Lincoln. Many of them were just relatives of the participants. Some of them were just unknown, they were called unknown, and so on. And some of them were from the Catholic Church. So we get a good idea what was in the minds of the free people of color, now the former free people of color, now free African Americans. What was in their mind during the pivotal years of the 1860s and 1870s? And that's why these registers are so important, because the only primary documents we have are a short-lived periodical, short-lived newspaper called the Tribune, and that was just for a few years. It terminated in 1869. So we get an idea by reading these messages. Now, most of them were just basically, I'm in another world and I'm okay, and so on and so forth. But some of them were very political in their meaning. And talked at the beginning, there were a lot that were anti-Catholic, so there was this disconnect between these the African Americans living in New Orleans with the Catholic Church, but at the same time there was a connect. They still liked the people that adhered to the Latin European idea of welcoming black people into the church. So we get a lot of that information from reading messages, spiritual messages from the great beyond. So Henry Louis Ray proceeded with this Le Cercle Harmonique for a number of years, and you can also see some of the political action going on at that time, such as the very famous Battle of Liberty Place, which we know about. Henry Louis Ray worked his way up in the political ladder. He was a representative at the Louisiana House. He was a representative. He also promoted this short-lived biracial school system. Maybe a lot of you don't realize that, but between 1871 and 1877, the school system in Orleans Parish was a mixed-race school system. He later on was on the board. He was actually on the board, and as soon as Reconstruction ended, he was out of the picture. He was gone. And that also coordinates with the end of the register. So by that time, people had kind of drifted away from the seance circles, and partially because of political reasons, and also some people had passed away, so there weren't people to replace the participant. As far as the organization, Le Cercle Harmonique, it was actually two groups meeting on different days of the week, and you would also have guest participants would come. They would meet in either the Marigny or Tremé. Sometimes they would even meet at the department, the Treasury Department, which at that time was close to where the Omni Orleans is. It's on Royal Street. And they meet there. Now why? Because one of the participants was a relative, Antoine Dubliquet, who was the secretary of the Treasury, and this was Francois Dubliquet. So Francois Dubliquet was one of the strongest participants, and he was also a close friend of Ray. He was also a close friend of Valmore as well, and it appears that well, in fact, we know he was a curator of these registers, and he kept them for years and years and years. Later on, his daughter married René Grandjean, who was a white Frenchman. They married in Jamaica. They couldn't marry in the United States because of the laws that prevented mixed race marriages. So Grandjean got into this family. He became interested in spiritualism. He looked at the registers. There's a lot of markings he made, extra notes that he took from his father-in-law, Francois Dubliquet. So Francois Dubliquet died in the early 1920s, and René Grandjean kept these registers, thank goodness. And later on, he got in touch with Dr. Joe Lodston, and Dr. Joe Lodston was pivotal in getting them donated to the University of New Orleans. I believe the year was 1976. But as I said earlier, Nothing much was done with the exception of Dr. Karen Bell. She did some work, and a few other people did some work in the registries. And I think that's it.
Yeah, well,
Okay, but unfortunately I don't have any pictures.
So-
well, I do have pictures, but I can't
yeah,
show
maybe you could describe how these seance circles were set up. So, Lewis Henry Ray was leading them, and he was the one conveying the messages from the beyond.
Right,
So-
and it appears that he wrote the messages down later on in these registers, for the most part. It's his handwriting. And then when they would meet several days of the week, and it would be at night. It would depend on the season, either 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, and they would close the doors, they would read over the messages, and then they would ask for the spirits to come in. There wasn't a lot of documentation in the seance registers about exactly what they saw. There was a few things about spirits, but they didn't describe what the spirits looked like, unfortunately.
But it's
I would have
fascinating
liked
that George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and I believe Benjamin Franklin,
right.
were among the visitors.
Right.
And with the strong message of maintaining that fervor for civil
Yeah,
rights.
yeah, it was sort of, sort of kind of like cheerleaders, to keep up the fight. And you would see the same phrases over and over and over, like, move on, keep it up, move forward. They would call it the banner, march behind the banner. Like they were representing truth and equality. And I think they were a little delusional about political rights. And later on you can see where they do become disillusioned as the national government did not help them out towards mid-1870s.
Since they had such a short window there where there was promise, and then to have it all dashed so quickly, you can see how that would obviously set in. When you had an integrated school system for a short period and then gone.
Right, it was for
Yeah.
6 years, and as
Yeah.
soon as Reconstruction ended, exactly that same month, they were gone. Henry Louis Ray, as well as most of the black members on that board. And interestingly enough, this is one thing I haven't seen in any other book, but also on that board was General James, what's his last name? What?
Overstreet?
Yeah, he was a big supporter of actually the school system. It was a board that actually worked very well, but it was all gone.
Yeah, as I mentioned to some of you who were gathered here earlier, we had Melissa at the Tennessee Williams Festival this past March, and as part of our programming, we actually staged a seance of this nature in a historic French Quarter house. And the spirits that came to speak to us were really quite fascinating. We were, according to the medium, visited by former Civil War soldiers who had actually been quartered in that house and who'd also been carousing at a bar across the street fairly frequently.
Oh, and we found out the bar was what? Do you remember? It was really a brothel.
Yes, I think in New Orleans.
That's why they kept going back and forth.
Yeah, the definition of
We
New
thought
Orleans
originally
is-
it was a bar, but no.
Well, liquor was involved, of course, but
Go hand in hand.
Yes, but these Civil War soldiers were very upset at our current political climate and felt that we could be on the verge of another Civil War based upon what they were conveying. But it was a fascinating experience. So we want to open up the floor to some questions.
We have about 5 minutes,
yes,
I believe.
Yes. So, yes, sir.
Was spiritualism politicized in other cities like New York and Boston?
Yeah, it was politicized to a certain extent,
So it's
and
not
generally it was
seances.
more of the liberal type of people that like spiritualism, but not always.
It was not seances where you were talking to your grandmother or...
Well, it was to a certain extent, but it was also, another thing was a lot of these mediums up north in particular were women, and attractive women, and it was, to me, it was a way to make money actually. But they would go into a trance, and it was like, it wasn't really them speaking, it was some other person. So there were a lot of political messages. that the spirits.
Was Houdini's? What was it?
That's later on. That's down, the 1920s,
Right.
but
That was not
1930s,
politicized.
1920s, I guess.
Seems like these things have revivals, every few decades. There seems to be another fervor of interest
Right.
in spiritualism and seances and things dealing with the occult. So, there's still a city in upstate New York, Lily Dale, that is the headquarters of the spiritualist movement. The entire town is populated by spiritualist mediums.
All politicized.
No,
I
these
wouldn't
are.
say so.
My wife and I actually visited there. We're not adherents to this, but what struck me is a lot of people who had experienced a lot of trauma and pain and deaths of family members who were very desperate to connect with
That's what I always thought
family
it
members.
was.
Mary Todd Lincoln was a frequent visitor there
Yeah.
after Abraham's assassination. So.
Yeah.
Another question?
And that's interesting you mentioned her, because I found this out very late and was too late to put it in my book, but I found about some seances held in the White House and involved her, not Lincoln.
He was more of a
The
skeptic.
person that was involved in it was Colonel Nathan Daniels, and he married a very famous spiritualist, Hatch, Cora Hatch. Maybe some of you have seen her. So everything's all connected. So he was at the seance and he wrote about it in his diary, but I have never seen it publicized. I did briefly mention it, that about this seance with Mary Todd Lincoln, but Lincoln himself was in the White House, but he wasn't at the seance.
I can't really see the photograph, but I'm interested in photography and the spiritual side of that, which, sometimes you encounter those photographs. Did you find those kind of photographs, like specifically
You talking about
in
this
New
one in
Orleans?
particular?
Yeah, well, I can't really see it, but did you find spiritual photography from New Orleans?
No,
No.
my publisher did this cover,
Uh-huh, yeah.
And it really has nothing to do with New Orleans,
Yeah.
but it looks good anyway.
Yeah.
So,
I work at the Museum of Art in New Orleans, and we do have a collection of spiritualist
Oh, you do?
photographs.
Oh,
right,
right.
from the 19th century.
Is that something people can view?
It was they're in our archives, so no, not right now, but we probably will have a special program at some point.
Yeah.
But yes, there was a phenomenon in the 19th
There
century
was-
of photography
yeah.
of that sort.
yeah, where you would see the picture of Mary Todd Lincoln and her husband behind her. People were playing around. It was like early Photoshop, you
Well,
know.
tell Russell to go ahead and put those out. We'd love to see
He
them.
has done a program on it in the
Yeah.
past. I'll suggest it again. It'd be great for Halloween.
Yeah.
Yes. Someone else?
The Wall Street Journal had 2 weeks ago a large article on the so-called photographs, and they have disproven that scientifically as to how that was done. So you might want to check the Wall Street Journal.
The
But
so-called what?
Spiritualist
The question that
photographs.
I have.
Oh yeah, that's been out for a while. I mean,
But this was 2 weeks ago.
okay.
Okay, in the Sunday or Friday edition of the journal. What I would like to, there was a large British movement in the end of the 19th century in spiritualism. Oliver Wendell Holmes, all kind of very famous writers participated in this movement. Was there any connection with the American movement and what was going on in Britain?
Yeah, I speak a little bit about that in the book, but mostly about France, what was going on in France. The movement that began actually in the United States moved over to Victorian England and over to
So
France.
it moved into Victorian.
Yeah,
Because
right.
that's when it was very prevalent.
Yeah, it was very popular in the 1870s, 1880s.
End of the 19th century.
And spiritualism, the popularity waned 1870s, 1880s, and a lot of it was because these people were exposed as charlatans. A lot of them were charlatans, and it was big, sort of like magic tricks, they were exposed like, okay, this is how this is done. Particularly in the American sector, there were things going on like musical instruments flying around and things like that. It was a little more fantastic, a little more paranormal, the type of things you would think. They don't mention, in the registers, there's nothing really talking about music or things flying around in the room, things like that. Sometimes the spirits would get mad. And I want to say this before I forget, but I'll have an article coming out in Louisiana Cultural Vistas. The next issue, the December issue, will have an article called Black Creole Circles. And once again, that's Louisiana Cultural Vistas.
Well, we have to wrap things up. Melissa is going to sell books and sign them down at the book tent, so I would encourage you all to go and check that out. And it is really, we owe you a great debt of gratitude for translating those minutes. I mean, they were really just waiting for the right person.
They were waiting for me. That's right, it was fate.
And it's really an amazing record, and not just a window into spiritualist thought of that era, but into the entire political and social climate of that era, and particularly the situation these free people of color found themselves in before the Civil War, through the war, and then after.
Exactly.
So, thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.